Hello and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, to give you another walk through the front line. I am going to do the walk through the front line first and then talk to some degree about the conscription that Putin, the mobilisation that Putin announced yesterday, what that will entail and what it will mean. There's quite a bit of discussion to be had on that and bring up a few extra tidbits for you. So here we are with the map of Ukraine and where things are. Not a great deal of change, but a few little moments of interest in various places. I'm going to take you to the Kharkiv, going into Luhansk region. And the first thing to say is, as we know from the rapid advance in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukraine moved up to the Oskil River, and the Russians retreated behind the Oskil River, and that's broadly where the defensive line is. Kupiansk, which is this city that is split in two over the Oskil River, with the industrial and logistical side on the eastern half of the town there, and you can kind of see that here. Kupiansk has been liberated pretty much fully by the Ukrainians. The problem is, and this is what I talked about with regard to maintaining momentum. So there's been a bit of a dilemma for the Ukrainians, I would have thought, which is that in a counteroffensive like the one they've had, you want to maintain momentum, because as long as you've got momentum, the defenders are on the back foot. They don't quite know where you're going. They're not prepared. They certainly weren't prepared. But Ukraine stopped. Why did they stop? Well, they need to make sure that they are prepared for the next stage of what they're planning on doing. They need to make sure they've got logistics lines sorted, and that they are being supplied with all the things they need. They don't want to become isolated and stretch themselves too far. The flip side of that is that you are giving, by slowing down and sorting those things out, you are giving your opposition a chance to sort themselves out, to defend, to get things into place, to bring reinforcements and all that kind of stuff. So what appears to have happened is that the Russians have sorted out artillery to some degree and are hemming the Ukrainians in Kupiansk, and this will give them the ability to start flattening Kupiansk. And that's not ideal for the Ukrainians. So there's a bit of an issue here, by point of fact that the Ukrainians appear to be, not quite stuck in Kupiansk, but certainly not moving, and they are under some pressure from artillery and the Russians, who have had a chance to sort themselves out to some degree. Okay, so that's what's going on in Kupiansk. When we go, so that's up here in Kupiansk, as you can see, the logistics are on the eastern side of the river, and they are being hassled there. They are making slow advances around the Izium area and around Seversk there. Lyman is still not fully liberated, and there was the thought that it would be by now, but they are having a bit of trouble around here, a bit of a stalemate. The Ukrainians have taken this village of Drobisheve, and that is a bit of a movement, but as you can see, that's not a great deal. There's actually further progress by the Ukrainians slightly further down the line here towards Lysychansk. Okay, so if we zoom out a little bit, what has happened is that traditionally, over the last few months, Bakhmut has been the area that has been under pressure, particularly by the Wagner mercenaries, and the Russians have made the most progress around here that they have anywhere, even though that has been painfully slow for everyone involved. But the Ukrainians have been making some decent progress. So let's get to the right map, around Spirna, and they are moving inwards here to the east. What this has prompted the Russians to do is pull some of their troops out from the Bakhmut area and reinforce further up here, which has meant that Bakhmut has not moved over the last day. Nothing much has happened there. And the Russians are piling in some resources to stop the Ukrainian advance in this Spiona area. And this has been a good point of progress for the Ukrainians. If they start to break through the lines here, then of course Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Rubizhne, these are Kreminna. These are all under threat of being liberated as far as the Russians are concerned. So they need to plug this gap, and they're plugging this gap by their Wagner mercenaries and reinforcements from further down the Donetsk front line. So that is a major, well, it's not huge, but there's something of interest going on around this part of the front line. But most elsewhere, it is fairly unmoving. And the same can be said all the way down the lines. Obviously, if there's no movement, it doesn't mean things aren't happening. As I always say, there's still going to be artillery and fighting going on. It's just that there is no territorial gain on either side. So as we move further down the Zaporizhzhia front line, and we get to Kherson. Again, Kherson, not much movement. Let me compare two maps. So this is a Kherson map of September the 21st from the Institute for the Study of War. This is last night's map. And this is September the 17th. So this is 4 days of fighting. The major difference is they've changed the colour of the water. So that's the 17th. Really, there's a tiny bit of movement down there. But otherwise, basically no movement at all in Kherson. There has been some attempts by Ukraine to take a couple of settlements down here. There's a bit of no man's land down there as well, with a couple of settlements in it. Ukraine attacked, and then Russia counterattacked, and Russia have actually taken back the no man's land territory, as according to some sources. So a little bit of a setback, but kind of what you'd expect with the give and take of an attritional front. Kherson here, this line of attack down on the southern section of the Kherson front line is the closest to Kherson. And you'd think, well, that's surely the most obvious place to attack. The problem is the Russians have their artillery zeroed in here. They don't need to do an awful lot to accurately hit positions and people moving forward and equipment. So although this is the closest and in some sense easiest route towards Kherson, it's actually the most dangerous. And that's why you see not a lot of movement down there at the moment. And there's perhaps going to be greater success by flanking Kherson from the Vidibrid or further north. But again, these aren't moving a lot. So not a lot of movement all over the front line. There is some interesting stuff further up north on the Donetsk, the northern part of the Donetsk front line. So that brings us on to discussions of, I need to zoom out, discussions of Putin and the partial mobilization. There is an argument to say it isn't that partial. I think what Putin's doing here is basically saying he can take what he needs when he needs to. And although there's 300,000 now, that's not to say that if they need more, they can't go further. And it looks like there's going to be sort of 3 levels of recruitment, of mobilization. So the first level is going to be people up to sort of the age of 35 who are previously contracted soldiers. What does that mean? Well, Russia has a conscription every year, and they have this kind of rotating conscription that goes on, and people go into national service and they are conscripts, but they can't really go and fight on the front line because they are merely conscripts. Right at the beginning of the war, there was a claim that, well, don't worry, there are no conscripts involved in this special military operation except there were conscripts that were found dead all over the shop. So that was just what shouldn't have happened, really, as far as Russia is concerned, but it was what was happening. Anyway, conscripts aren't supposed to be, fighting in different theatres. They are just doing their national service. And then you get the choice of becoming a contracted soldier. And that's you full-time fighting for the Russian armed forces. Now, what the first wave, I think, of mobilisation will concern those contracted soldiers up to a certain age, people who have already had a fighting experience. Why is that important? You don't really need to train them up as much. You might need to just freshen them up to, what the requirements will be for being in the armed forces again, some basic training, and then get them on the front line after equipping them. So that's what the initial mobilisation will be about. And the age limits will be set fairly sensibly. And then you'll have a second wave that will include conscripts who will require a bit more training because they've only done the conscription training. And the age will be increased. And the third sort of level of mobilisation will be people who have never been in the armed forces. And again, the age might be played around with a little bit there, but those people will require a lot more training. So initially, they're going to want the best soldiers they can get, people who have had, or the best recruits they can get, people who have had experience previously by fighting as a contracted soldier. And they will be added. So the other reason they're doing these referenda in these 4 regions. So I talked about the sham referenda in Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Even though none of these regions are fully under the control of Russia, they are holding these referenda in order to say, hey, look, these are part of Russian territory now. If you attack us, woe betide anyone who attacks us, because now we can react fully because you've attacked, the territory of Russia. But it's not only about that. It's about being able to forcibly conscript anyone who is in these regions. So not only are you going to get people from Russia, but you are going to get conscripts from all of these regions. Already we've seen conscription going on in Luhansk and Donetsk. You've got the LPR and DPR, LNR, DNR forces who are fighting, who have had to conscript people into their forces because they're running low on troops. And so there's been some forced conscription. We've seen people being beaten into conscription in these areas. Well, now that's going to spread further to all these 4 regions, and I think these referenda will be about being able to mobilise troops behind it. But of course, you've got the problem here of people who aren't necessarily pro-Russia being conscripted in, people who don't want to fight, and this goes for all of the Russian mobilised troops. You're going to have very low morale troops who are being forced to do what they don't want to do. If they wanted to do it, they would have already signed up and volunteered. Right, so these are going to be people who don't generally want to be there. And as they say, morale is a force multiplier. So it's if you have low morale troops fighting against high morale troops, you are going to be at a disadvantage no matter what's going on with equipment and other things and logistics. So that is a real disadvantage for the Russians in sending in these troops. So the real question, there's so much to talk about with regards to this mobilization. The real question is, what does Putin seek to achieve by this mobilization? Because he's not producing any extra equipment, any different or upgraded equipment. He is producing a bunch of people who have low morale and who will be very poorly trained, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And he's introducing them into the theatre as if they are going to change the course of the war. At the moment, with troops that are better than those troops, the Russians are losing. the attrition is so high that they've been forced to bring these troops in. But these new troops aren't going to change the course of this war. So I don't understand what the intention is of Putin. Well, actually, I do understand, because Putin had no choice. This is all Putin could do. So this is what Philip O'Brien says when questioned about this. See, I'm not a Russian mobilization expert, but see this as the minimum that Putin could do. I would go one further and say it's both the minimum and the maximum. If he had mobilized any more than this, had a full national mobilization, then the Russian population would have kicked off more than it has. So there have been riots or protests, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but all over the nation. Those haven't been massive because it's very dangerous. There have been heaps of arrests, well over 1,500 arrests, I believe, and they won't change anything. However, they will communicate a level of discontent to the rest of the population who are watching the news and or listen to their friends and so on and so forth. So there is that. There's the idea that people that are going to try and escape mobilization and flee abroad, Putin is happy to lose people like that because they don't then cause a problem back at home. And if they are rich elite sorts who might be people who could eventually seek power, better to have those people abroad than in Russia. So there's not too much of an issue for Putin in losing those people. You do get the problem of brain drain, continued brain drain, and money going out of the country and stuff like that. But they haven't closed the airports down at the moment, which is kind of an interesting sign. But what there is the restriction of movement of men, particularly from different regions within Russia. So conscription happens within regions, and so they're basically, most of the regions appear to be saying you can't leave this region. So there's going to be some discontent going on because of the general restrictions of life, because they have a very old-fashioned way of conscripting, which we need to know where you're living, and you need to live in this kind of region so we know where you're living and we can conscript with that knowledge. There's also, I think, part of this mobilization has been about being able to tell Russian businesses what they have to build or create or produce on behalf of the Russian state for the army. In other words, mobilization isn't just about the troops. It's about being able to tell dictate to your economic infrastructure and your manufacturing sector what they need to do in order to support the war effort. So there is going to be that going on. But anyway, Philip O'Brien says, not a Russian mobilization expert, but see this as the minimum that Putin can do. His army would start running out of soldiers in the first half of 2023 otherwise. That being said, this seems more a move that will prolong Russian defeat. So some people are saying, yeah, this will add cannon fodder into the theatre of war, but it's not going to change it. It's the minimum he could do. He had to do something, right? Otherwise, they were going to lose within a few months. So he's mobilizing a bunch of troops, but these are going to be poor morale and poorly trained troops. And it's not going to really change anything. It will just merely prolong defeat. Shashank Joshi, who writes for The Economist, saying, and he's quoting, I think possibly, he's quoting Wall Street Journal saying, the experience of the so-called Mobiks, the forcibly mobilized soldiers from Luhansk and Donetsk. So just what I was saying earlier is that they've already conscripted people here, and shows the depth of the Russian predicament. They were sent to fight with pre-World War II vintage Mosin Nagant rifles and with antiquated steel helmets. So there's plenty of evidence to say that the conscripted soldiers sent in here were literally cannon fodder, sent in with pre-World War II equipment, helmets and rifles, and just terrible equipment, and sent into the front lines to do the business for the Russians. So if that's what the model that we've got for these further conscripts, both from within the occupied territories but also in Russia, then Russia's in trouble. Phillips O'Brien also says, unless Putin had put in place a serious training system already, and there's evidence that the trainers have been, many of them been sent to the front line, so the training is not going to be up to scratch. And we're going to talk about how that isn't up to scratch anyway at the best of times in a second. That will be impossible to do quickly, so more likely they will rush unmotivated and out of shape reservists into combat worn, out of date, or poorly maintained equipment. So this is bad soldiers into bad equipment sent into poorly thought out frontline offensives. This isn't going to end well for Russia, and it seems to just be a case of prolonging the inevitable. Another thread here I'm going to read to you by Andriy Zagorodnyuk. The partial mobilization of reservists is a sign of Russia's failure to achieve its operational objectives in Ukraine through both its use of regular forces and the call up for volunteers. So it's an important indicator that the Russian army is exhausted and has recognized its inability to defeat Ukraine. I do not believe that situation will significantly change with mobilization. Exactly what I've just been saying. Firstly, mobilized soldiers will need substantial new training, even if they have previously served in the Russian army. Most of the reservists are former conscripts who previously served in the armed forces. For the vast majority, the compulsory army service was a daunting and largely unproductive experience. Thus, the quality of their training was low. So already their previous training was low. As a result, they were unprepared for real war, particularly not one as intense as today. Secondly, personnel is only a part of the capability structure, and Russia has problems with all components of capability. Doctrine. So doctrine is how they're taught how to do war. So artillery barrages of settlements and then driving in afterwards after they've flattened it is a kind of Soviet doctrine, it seems. Organization. Leadership, so the idea that they're very top down, they don't give a lot of, they don't enfranchise their NCOs, their non-commissioned officers further down to be able to make decisions for themselves and react to battlefield variables. And weapons. Russia severely lacks experienced battlefield officers. It also struggles with delivering new weapons. This is absolutely true. The officer situation up and down the front is pretty dire for the Russians, and they're sending in a whole load of unmotivated, poorly trained soldiers that will need some kind of leadership. Finally, mobilization is going to be very unpopular in Russia. The government plans to push the defensive war narrative with its propaganda. It will advertise the idea of defending Russia from NATO, and that's all about these referenda succeeding in making this all part of territorial Russia, these four regions. The problem is that Russians do not perceive newly occupied regions of Ukraine as Russia, and the motivation to die for recently annexed regions will be very low. If Russia annexes new regions, that will not stop Ukraine from taking them back. How Putin will explain the loss of those territories to his citizens just after their annexation is unclear, but it certainly won't boost his popularity. I believe this will be another unsuccessful escalation attempt for Putin. Ukraine will continue to fight no matter what. Of course, sending more people means a potential intensification of the war. We encourage our allies to continue to supply weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. We will win this together. So this is to say that this is all that Putin could really do, is send in a bunch of rubbish troops. But actually, Ukraine have got some elbow room to improve their scenario with the use of NATO, where Russia can only add more troops and not add better equipment, although they are getting some kamikaze drones called loitering munition, drones that can fire down and blow up themselves into equipment. They are getting a bunch of them from Iran, but basically they're not really changing their battlefield capabilities in terms of equipment. Whereas there are loads of discussions going on as with regards to Ukraine and being able to provide Ukraine with ATACMS missiles. It appears that Ukrainian pilots are being trained in the US on fighter jets, your whatever fighter jets, depending on what they might end up giving them. And this gives Ukraine greater capabilities going forward if they need them. At the moment, they don't need them technically because they're winning this war with just what they've already got. And all Russia are going to do is add more grist to the mill, more cannon fodder. What's the other things to say about this? So while Shoigu, so the defense minister, said mobilized soldiers will receive weeks of training, local enlistment offices already state that they will send some men without the training course. Russia is in a hurry. So here's some local enlistments in Russian. Sorry, I can't translate that for you, but I've seen this all around the internet to suggest that basically it appears that enlistment centers are saying, we're going to send some of you without training because you're already well enough trained or whatever. And so this is just another indication that Russia really want to hurry their troops to the front lines because they realize that the momentum has not been in their favor and they want to get this done as quickly as possible. So a chap called Mark Hertling, he's well worth following on Twitter. So he's a former army officer, was commanding general of the United States Army Europe and the 7th Army, and he's served doing armor, cavalry planning, operations and training positions. So he knows about training, and he's commanded every organization from platoon to field army. So this guy knows what he's talking about, right? Here is a thread he's written on training. Putin's announced mobilization of 300,000 reservists was jaw-dropping to me this morning, but not for the reason some might suspect. Why? Because know how Russian soldiers are trained, in basic training and in their units. A brief thread on some facts. While I commanded US Army Europe before retiring, before I commanded all basic and advanced soldier training for the Army, during that period, around 150,000 new soldiers per year at then 5 basic training sites and 21 advanced training locations received training. So in America, that's how they did it. 150,000 trained soldiers a year through 5 basic and 21 advanced training locations. It's a lot. It's intense resources put into training in the American Army and with all NATO forces. Most US soldiers get 10 weeks of basic training. Some get more at one station unit training, OSUT, sites like infantry, artillery, military police. Those that don't go to OSUT travel to different length courses for advanced training in a speciality, logistics, intelligence, etc. It's a long period of time trained by very professional drill sergeants. There is an extremely high resource overhead to all of this. Soldiers report to their units ready to be integrated in the specific mission. So they go to their units after they've been fully basic trained and advanced trained. Remember, the US population is 344 million and we train about 150,000. Russia, on the other hand, has a population of 144 million citizens, so well less than half, spread over 11 time zones, a much more vast country in terms of geography. Theirs is a conscript force with a basic training site. So only one basic training site in Lubinsk in southern Russia. Some Russian army get advanced speciality training, but most soldiers get most training in their first unit. So they get some basic training and then go to their unit for training. Russian soldiers got just a few days of basic training before being sent to Belarus starting last November for the pre-invasion. So during 2 visits to Russia, I saw basic and unit training. It was awful. Familiarization versus qualification on rifles. So what that means is they just became familiar with rifles rather than being fully qualified in shooting those rifles to a high level of competency. Rudimentary first aid, very few simulations to conserve resources, and most importantly, horrible leadership by scare quotes, drill sergeants. What that very few simulations means that going out and firing live rounds in a simulated environment, the Russians hardly do that because they don't want to use up their resources, even though they've got vast amounts of ammunition. Officers admitted to me that theirs was a 1-year force, with some, the poorest, volunteering or being elected for leadership roles. Remember, Russian soldiers get almost all training in units versus at basic training. How units are resourced plays a big part. One tank unit I visited near Moscow proudly told me they get one tank round per crew each year. So they get to shoot in training one tank round for an entire tank crew per year. That's incredible. US units spend hours in simulators, and crews fire dozens of real rounds a year. So that simulator, those are machines, a bit like a flight simulator. You can get tank simulators and all sorts and whatnot. By the way, Ukraine's army has taken the US model to heart after receiving training from US personnel in both individual and unit training techniques since 2014, and other NATO training as well. The UK is very much involved in that. The establishment of JMTGU by US Army Europe was instrumental in that. But I digress. The issue is the Russian army is poorly led and poorly trained. That starts in basic training and doesn't get better during the Russian soldiers' time in uniform. Mobilizing 300,000 reservists after failing with depleted conventional forces and ragtag militias, recruiting prisoners and using paramilitaries like the Wagner Group will be extremely difficult. And placing newbies on a front line that has already been mauled, has low morale, and who don't want to be portends more Russian disaster, jaw-dropping, a new sign of Russian weakness. So that's his account. Say, look, the training is already terrible, the morale is low, and they're going to be sending more of these with even poorer training and even poorer morale onto the front line. This can only end badly for Russia. So I think those few threads that I've read you are a really interesting indication of how much trouble Russia are in going forward. And the idea is that Putin really didn't have any option, because he has no more things to throw into the front lines other than human bodies. They're out of equipment. They're already drawing some of their defensive equipment, as I've said, from St. Petersburg, these S-300s, which I'll show you in another video. And they're even using some of these as, those are like air defense. So they should be shot at planes, and jets, helicopters or UAVs, drones. But they're using them to attack ground forces, which just shows that they are in a lot of trouble when it comes to equipment. So they've got nothing else they can throw at this other than human bodies or nukes, tactical nukes or human bodies. Those are the two options they have. They've gone for human bodies, but only the amount of human bodies they can get away with without the Russian public getting too angry. They're getting angry, but not angry enough to unseat Putin. If they had gone for full national mobilization, it could have been even worse. So he's gone with the only option that he possibly could. And just to hammer home the equipment problem that Russia have, is the idea. General Hecker has said that Kyiv's air force is still 80% intact. Wow, we are 7 months into this. And this is what I talked about in one of my earlier videos, the seed operations. The Russians didn't do seed operations, which is suppression of enemy air defense. So the air defense includes, surface-to-air missiles, but also includes the air force itself. And they didn't knock out the Ukrainian air force, which they should have done in the first week. Should have just obliterated all ability for the Ukrainians to use their air force. They didn't do that, and as a result, the Ukrainian air force has been operating. And still 7 months down the line, at 80% capability. That's unbelievable. Okay, they've been given, equipment by the former Soviet nations of Eastern Europe. So they've been given sort of MiGs and other planes that they can cannibalize and fix their existing planes. And it appears that they are, as I said, getting trained in the US and elsewhere in Europe on goodness knows what. But they are still there and doing their stuff, whereas the Russian Air Force is predominantly hiding and firing munitions, ordnance from a vast distance away, because they're scared of getting too involved, because the air defense is still there. Air Force officials said that it could take 2 to 3 years to provide the Ukrainians with F-16 if a political decision was made. General Hecker said, but as we now pass 200 days in the war, I think folks are starting to think more long term. So these are the hints that you're going to start getting F-16s and probably some of the older US jets being touted as replacing the older Soviet era jets that the Ukrainians are using, as well as some of the more modern ones they have as well. So this is now the Overton window, what's acceptable to talk about with regard to supplying the Ukrainians with equipment is being constantly shifting. Earlier on, we're like, oh, we can't give them, right at the beginning, we're like, we can't give them tanks. And now we're giving them tanks. Okay, we can't give them, we can't give them self-propelled howitzers. Okay, we're giving them that. We can't give them, okay, we're giving them that. And it's just moving and moving. Oh, we can't give them HIMARS. We're giving them HIMARS. And as long as Russia doesn't basically send nukes, I mean, that's what it comes down to. That's a calculation. What can we give them such that Russia doesn't send nukes? Because they've got nothing else. All they've got is their existing army and their troops. They can add more troops, but they can't categorically shift their capabilities, right? So if we would just give Ukraine a bit more, yeah, they haven't sent nukes. We'll give them a bit more, yeah, they haven't sent nukes. That seems to be the way of operating in terms of providing Ukraine with stuff, and as little as we can get away with in terms of the type of equipment that will do the job for the Ukrainians. So we don't want to give them ATAC until we don't have to, because if the Russians get hold of that, then that's a bunch of technology they can nick off us. But if push comes to shove, we can give them that, as long as Russia doesn't send in nukes as a result of us giving them that. So the Americans will be thinking. And if the Russian troops these reservists do provide too big a thorn in the side of Ukraine, then the Ukraine have places to go. There are different types of equipment that should put the Russians in their place. Anyway, I hope that was useful for you. That was mainly a talk about the mobilization. I will talk a bit more about equipment as I started yesterday in yesterday's video. Please check that out. I start discussing the different types of Russian military equipment they're using on the front lines. I will continue that in another video. And so please check out yesterday's video. As ever, like, subscribe, hit the bell, notifications. What are the other buzzwords? Yeah, you can join the channel. It's membership. There's thanking me with a coffee if you want, or you can just keep watching these videos. That'd be great. Please share them around if you think they're useful. As ever, thanks for popping by, and I guess I'll see you tomorrow.